Before you comment something stupid, which will be, this is the most accurate, please stay away from that, because you're just plugging up my comment section with dumb stuff and you're gonna feel dumb about your comment later. I'm not trying to be a total troll. I just like to troll, okay? Hi guys, it's Alyssa and welcome back to another daily-ish video from my channel, me and my channel, The Divine Venus. Today we're gonna talk about the accuracy of different forms of astrology. For a long time, when I was doing tropical Western astrology, there would be a lot of commenters talking to me about how much more accurate Vedic or sidereal is over tropical Western astrology, and they would date it back to its ancient roots and its tradition, and that it's just more accurate. Recently, maybe the last year, I've been getting a lot more questions, not just about Vedic or sidereal, they're not the same thing, versus tropical Western, but also about whole sign and Hellenistic astrology and its accuracy compared to, say, tropical or Placidus. Now, if you're very confused about this whole thing, that's okay. You might want to enjoy it just for the history lesson I'm about to give you. The first thing I want you to do is, before this video starts really going into the energy, I want you to lose the question or the answer that you have in your head. And that is blank astrology more accurate than blank astrology? Get that out of your head. Now, if you have the answer and it's like blank astrology is more accurate than blank astrology, also get that out of your head. I'm here to talk about how nothing is more accurate and everything is more accurate, because if you can read something, if you are drawn to something, you, the reader, will make it more accurate. And that's all you need to know. But let's get into the history of why that is. So let's go back about 5,000 years ago, give or take. Let's imagine that this world was not split up as it is today. Let's imagine that the United States of America, which has only been around for 200-ish years, isn't even a thought in the history of humanity. Doesn't have any pull or any power. Nobody even gives a shit. Let's see what existed instead. We have the Mesoamerica, Mayans, Aztecs. We have the Chinese in its location area that it is today. We have the Indus Valley. This would have been India, modern day India as we know it today. We would have the Egyptian Empire, and then we would have Mesopotamian. Let's stop at Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is marked by its fact that it had two great rivers running through it, the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Back in ancient days, water would have been your main resource you would head into. Like, you would want water, because we can live off of the plants, we can live off of the animals, but what we really need is clean, drinkable water. So if you are a civilization trying to start out, you would have the most luck running to water. So Mesopotamia is one of the most ancient that we still have history of, and it's because of these two rivers. Now, the Egyptian Empire is also very ancient because of the Nile. We're talking more about astrology, so I want to base my timelines on how astrology came about in these areas. One area, one great city that I want us to focus on, and that city is Babylon. So now if we look at Mesopotamia, modern day Mesopotamia would run on Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. So we can say the Mesopotamia is the Middle East. We began in the Middle East. This seems to be the most ancient land that we have, but obviously I am not an expert historian, and I did not invent history, and I don't have memories of that time in my brain. I know what I've researched, but pretty much the consensus and historians will say that Mesopotamian is the oldest we know to date, and Mesopotamian known as the Fertile Crescent. If the earth was drier back then, maybe before the Great Floods, people would have fled to water. So the Middle East most likely is the most ancient place on earth, and that is why it is unstable, and that is why there are wars fought for it and by it through our entire modern day history. Persia in the Persian Empire actually was from Turkey. The Roman Empire tried to infiltrate Mesopotamia around 2,000 years ago and actually succeeded for a little while until that ended, because it did. The Middle East is a battleground because of the power that it has. Now, most people in religions have heard about Babylon. Babylon being the great wicked city that fell. Babylon was probably the biggest city, the first great city of its time, or of our time. They say it probably had about 200,000 people in it. And it would have been probably the biggest city around 1700 BC for about 100 years. And again, around 600 BC or BCE until 300 BCE. So for 300 years before our current time, so 2,000 years ago, Babylon was considered the biggest city in the entire world. Now, Babylon was built on the Euphrates River. If you point out Babylon on a map now, it's about 85 kilometers or 50-ish miles south of Baghdad. Interestingly enough, so when Saddam Hussein ruled over Iraq, he actually tried to revitalize the Babylonian ruins. Now, obviously, he was assassinated, and when that happened, the United States actually built a military troop on those ruins. So now let's understand Babylon, and then I'm just going to say that during this time, the Indus Empire and the Egyptian empires would trade in these areas. They were all connected by land and by boat. So they would have actually influenced each other a lot. There's a lot of influence going around. This is also, some people will say certain places stole, but I've heard Greeks say that Egyptians stole, or all these great empires have their own history, and history is written by the winners, or at least passed down through its own channels. So there is this deep period of Greek rule, and that is known as the Hellenistic Period, okay? Now this began with the emergence of the Mediterranean history, or around 300 BCE to 30 BCE. This Hellenistic period was huge for art, for study, for scientific study, for astronomy and astrology. And there was great astrology that came from that period, but it wasn't the first astrology. And this is interesting too, because a lot of people believe that Vedic astrology, which was only recently called Vedic astrology, by the way, it's based on the Vedas, which are very ancient, but they say that Vedic astrology was actually influenced by Hellenistic astrology, which is only 2,000 years old. I believe a lot of Indians will argue that point, and they say that it's the most ancient. It could be, but the astrology and how it works doesn't predate Hellenistic astrology as far as records show. But obviously history is written by the winners. So let's just keep that in mind. The one big thing though that we want to look at is Babylonian astrology, because Babylonian astrology is the first ancient astrology that we have record of. And they say that this could have been invented around 2,000 years BC. Ancient Babylonian astrology used the seasons as tropical modern astrology does today. Now, they were very primitive in their understanding, but they also did believe that the gods influenced them. One of the big understandings in the Mesopotamian society, or the empire back then, was that there was a god that gave them water. And obviously, that is all you would need to stay alive. Now, they also used a bunch of other gods to describe each of these planets, one of them being Ishtar. Now, Ishtar predates Venus Aphrodite. She is pretty much exactly the same. To get into Babylon, there is a gate, the gate of Ishtar. And they really did have a lot of ancient understanding of these gods and of astrology. They divided into horoscopes and astrological zodiac signs. They say Hellenistic astrology wasn't around till about 100 BCE, or maybe 200 years. So Hellenistic astrology took a lot from Babylonian astrology, because it would have been that period when the Greeks started to take over and took a lot of things, influenced. Now, Hellenistic astrologies take a lot of their information from Hermes Trismegistus, which wrote the As Above, So Below, the Emerald Tablet, but Egyptian call that the Emerald Tablet of Thoth. I can't say Thoth for the life of me. So Hermes and Thoth are the same understanding. And they say that Hellenistic Greek astrologers took this from Egyptian and Babylonian understanding. But most say that Hermes actually created the houses in astrology. So that's a very interesting thing because we can't even confirm that this guy existed. We could not know what this information is. It was just written down. For instance, did you know that the Trojan War would have been 13,000-ish BCE? That means like 15,000 years ago. And in the movie, they're dressed just as if it was 2,000 years ago, so I'm confused about that. But it was written 2,000 years ago by Homer in the Iliad as Greek information of a fight between Greece, Sparta, and Troy, which is now Turkey, which if you kind of look at it, it looks a little bit made up at this point, just as a mythology that was recreated to modern times Greece to actually tell the story. Because back then, 13,000 years before the story was even told, the barriers and the boundaries of that area would have been completely different. Greece itself, would it have lasted that long? That's an interesting concept. But Greece really wanted to have all of the information. So Greece did. The Romans took over from Greece. And this is because the Roman Empire was more around that area of BC to AD. Obviously, modern scholars have changed this to BC to CE because we no longer want Christ in it. And I'm not gonna tell you like anything based on Christianity or whatever. I don't care what you call it. But it was named after Jesus had died, AD, in the year of our Lord. Anno Domini. That's what it meant, in the year of our Lord. Because during the Roman Empire, there was this king, Herod, who heard that a great king would come in and take away all of the power of all of the kings and all of the empire, and that would be Jesus. So Herod had all newborn babies killed because he didn't want any king to usurp his power, because the Roman Empire at that time was the biggest empire. Obviously, the Roman Empire fell. When it did, Constantine was splitting up a lot of the information that Rome held based on Greek energy, the Hellenistic period, some old ancient Babylonian information in the Mesopotamian area, and Egyptian, and everything that would have come from before, and split it up into an ideology that would become modern day religion and the Roman Catholic Church. Even when Rome finally fell, the Roman Catholic Church did not. And they would have taken all of this ancient information and decided how they were going to split it up. Among that, they decided that astrology would be outlawed and banned, and so would women practicing any sort of intuitive arts. They would have been hunted down as witches. So that was a thing. All of this energy happened in the last 2,000 years, which then created the Dark Ages. And a lot of the knowledge and the information that we had was lost. But that was in that area. You see, India kept a lot of their knowledge. The Vedas were kept. Hinduism is the oldest religion still to date. And that is why I think a lot of Vedic astrologers who follow the Vedas, or it actually was called Jyotish, which means light, believe that their astrology is the most ancient because of the Vedas. But it's actually not true. The astrology wasn't invented. It was taken from the Vedas, which are Hinduism, the ancient texts, which were around 1200 BC or BCE. And that is why if you look at a lot of Hellenistic astrology, which was just recently in the past 20-ish years uncovered, this is a thing. Hellenistic astrology and using whole sign astrology was recently brought up because it was recently discovered. It had been lost. When modern astrologers started to discover this Hellenistic astrology, they realized it had a lot that aligned with Vedic astrology. Vedic astrology uses things like dashas, and Hellenistic astrology uses things like time lords. Very similar. There's a lot of overlap within the systems and how they work in both these versions of astrology. Now, Hellenistic astrology, being Greek, why would not have been taken through the Roman Empire? Is the Roman Empire wanted to establish control over other people and would have taken astrology out of education systems, therefore lost, rediscovered in more modern times. But there were astrologers who tried to advance astrology during this time, mostly men. There was a man named Claudius Ptolemy who actually used what we know today as the Placidus system in houses. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a geographer, and an astrologer. He actually used some scientific methods that are very important to Islamic and Western European science. He was a very smart dude. Now, when he was using his form of mathematical houses, he was using something that was not as wildly mainstream as they used whole sign houses, because whole sign is when the houses divide up with the signs. But he decided that mathematically these houses would shift. Now, when Placidus was named Placidus, it was named after the 17th century astrologer with the name of Placidus, Placidus de Titus. But obviously he was using something that was ancient. It was just more important for him, and he's the one who made it famous. When people saw the things he was doing with Placidus, they decided to adopt it as the main form of astrology in modern day. Placidus also was used in Arab astrology. Now, Saudi Arabia was a part of the Mesopotamian. Mesopotamia is, and still is today, as I said, a battleground. A lot has been lost there. A lot of power has been taken from that place. It is siphoned for use. But that is where the beginning of astrology was. Something also very interesting about Babylonian astrology was that its use of bringing down the stars to a seasonal system. Now, this is when tropical astrology would have been taken from. Now, the first indirect evidence for the regularized version of Babylonian astrology would have been 500 BCE. Obviously, as I said, we know that there is dated, much older Babylonian astrology. When we started to see it being regularized and used, that was in 500 BCE. Now, we also have indirect evidence that tropical modern astrology would have been uncovered at least 100 years later. Not too shabby. 2,000 years ago-ish, tropical astrology would have been discovered. It would have been the Greeks who discovered tropical astrology around that time. And so Hellenistic astrology still used whole sign, would have used tropical. So that would have set it apart from sidereal astrology being used in India. And as they grew their ideas around these subjects, would have been studying the stars from that way. The Greeks would have been studying from the precession of the equinoxes and pulling the stars down to Earth to align, where in India, they would have taken the sidereal zodiac and used their own understanding and built information off of that. This means that the information that is held in Hellenistic astrology would be just as accurate as that held in India with the sidereal, because they would have used time, information, and study to make sure it was correct. Now, India also had its own gods and goddesses and used that system based on that energy, as all astrology was considered divination in the beginning, especially in the Babylonian times. In Babylon, they used a lot of divination, a lot of gods and goddesses to get this accurate. It was, though, later that they would have taken more scientific approaches, which is when Placidus was invented. Placidus took these houses and decided to change the energy. Now, Cook, if you know anything about Cook version of this is just a highly more scientific, that's generally used by Germans now in astrology, but other people as well. That kind of makes the same technical chart points as Placidus, but it is a little bit different. Placidus is generally used by tropical astrologers. Vedic astrologers have been practicing the same astrology for the last 2,000 years because it didn't fall under the Roman Empire rule, which made it illegal or evil, and therefore was able to be practiced. A lot of the astrology that we had was lost. So these ideas of using annual perfections and time releasing information, this would have been something that we could have used and maybe developed over time and use it within the Placidus information. But the thing is Placidus was not widely used until after we had already lost a lot of whole sign astrology information because it wasn't allowed to be practiced. But now here we are at the end of the world, looking at all these different forms of astrology and trying to argue over which one is more accurate, when in reality they all came from the exact same place. Babylon. Now, even if you say Indian Jyotish astrology did come from the Vedas, which are very ancient information, astrology didn't come straight from these Vedas until astrology was invented elsewhere. And as you know, as I said, the Indus, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian empires all traded, all inspired each other, shared information. There's a lot of history being connected during those times that are lost now. Now, Western civilization did lose a lot, but now that it has found information, there's a point that is interesting to me, and it has to do with regression. I understand finding something old and wanting to use it because it is accurate. I understand that a lot. In fact, Holstein astrology is a lot easier than Placidus. It just is. It's more boom, 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 boom. It is what it is. Vedic astrology has so much already written for it that when you try to change it, you get a lot of Vedic astrologers on your ass about it. If I try to say that I can read the fact that I am a Kritika moon, but I can still say that a 22-degree Taurus moon is Kritika because I've just shifted the degrees over and put them into tropical, I'll get shit for it, even though it's just not rocket science. You can do that as long as you stay true to the sidereal degrees. You can move the sidereal to the tropical zodiac. Hello, but people get mad at it. Why? Why are people afraid of progress? You see, Placidus was progress. There's a reason why they discovered it was more accurate and why a lot of astrologers switched over to it back in the day. Nowadays, people want to switch over to Holstein, or they want to believe that sidereal is accurate. And I do believe that sidereal is accurate with Vedic astrology. I 100% believe that because they studied it for so long and they built their information off of those degrees. But when you try to use tropical understanding or Western understanding under a sidereal zodiac, you're going to be off, and you're going to figure that eventually. If you want to use whole sign, I think that's perfectly acceptable. But there are a lot of whole sign techniques that people are truthers of, and they say you can't use this technique with Placidus because it only works with whole sign. And I want to say, oh really? That thing you found out 2 years ago? You know exactly, because that shit's been lost for a really long time. If you want to use whole sign techniques with Placidus and you want to try it out, I'd say that's a good place to start progressing this astrology again. Because if we can get to a place where Placidus is less intuitive and more scientific, then we've gotten to a place where we've advanced science. Obviously, it's easier to say that certain things are more scientifically accurate when they're easier to read because it's more simplified. But if we could simplify Placidus and utilize certain ancient techniques and put it with Placidus and tropical zodiac, we are taking progress and using ancient ideas and putting them together and seeing what works and what doesn't. But telling people not to is like gatekeeping. It's like saying, no, we need to keep this ancient. We don't need to get rid of anything. We don't need to desecrate it. We need to honor it. But to say that you can't progress it goes against everything that Western civilization has always been about. It's what the world's been about. Obviously, we've been in the dark for a really, really long time, but now we're in the light. So if we can see the truth and we can see what is important in this world and what is important to us, I'd say that you can practice whatever kind of astrology you want to practice. Gatekeeping astrology is regressive and it's stupid. It can be accurate utilizing the planets Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. A lot of times people will say that you can't use those in certain information because they don't move fast enough. So say you're going to use a Time Lord technique, which is annual perfections and Hellenistic whole sign astrology. They will say that you can't actually use Neptune, Pluto, or Uranus because they move too slowly. If you are ruled by Neptune, Pluto, or Uranus, you might realize that that transit Neptune going so slow doesn't really affect a Pisces rising in a way that you think it's going to affect a Pisces rising. And that actually putting Jupiter makes things go too fast for the Pisces rising and you can no longer read what's happening. But if I use Neptune, I can get down to the core of my being. I can see why I was homeless at a certain point in time because Neptune hit 2 very crucial degrees in my chart, where Jupiter was doing great things for my career. I didn't have one. This is the energy that I'm talking about. Utilizing the planets that we couldn't see with our eyes in ancient times, but utilizing them in a progressed form of astrology is not incorrect. It's progressive. And it's hard to progress something more if you don't have enough attention drawn to it. So I understand people who don't use them. They don't want to learn and they really like the way that their practice is. I'm not like that. I know a lot of people aren't like that because there's something also called past lives. And a lot of people born in this age have spent a lot of many lifetimes learning astrology and learning the old way, and they're bored of it. I can look at anything, any form of old astrology, and I can pick it up in 5 seconds and I can utilize it in someone's chart and it'll be accurate. Why? Because it's in my blood. So why would I keep using that? I don't have to. I can figure out how you can progress certain ideas. So, do I know how to put annual perfections into a Placidus astrology chart. Not yet, but I think that it can be done. And when I do it, I expect to be met with a lot of regressive astrologers' opinions on what you can and cannot do. If you can do astrology with sidereal and be accurate, astrology with Dritish and be accurate, if you can do astrology with whole signs and be accurate, if you can do astrology with Placidus and be accurate, then you can be accurate no matter what you do. You know what that means? It's as above, so below. The Emerald Tablet. If it can exist, it can be done. It's just about letting go of our need for one thing to be right and everything else to be wrong. We are all connected as one, and we were once all connected from the same source. And that's why each civilization has information that is eerily similar. What about the pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids in Maya and Aztecs? Did they see each other? Were there aliens? All we know is that we had a strong source of connection back in the day, and that a lot of astrology stems from that. But the most ancient practices of it are from Babylon. And I feel like there's an astrological Babylon going on right now. And I don't care what people practice. I like to troll. But I just think that it's really important to see where you're coming from. And if you are a truly gifted astrologer, you could learn every single one. And if you want to, you can learn every single form of astrology and put them together in your practice, because it's not that big of a deal. We all came from the same place and we're all going to the same place. And if we can't coexist based on the knowledge of history, then we can't coexist. But that's not my fault. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.